The Legacy video series sponsored by Virtus Nutrition has the goal of documenting the history and development of significant breakthrough events occurring in the nutrition of dairy cattle. And today, the development and commercialization of calcium salts of fatty acid is the highlight event. Although fat supplements had been fed to dairy cattle for many decades, it was the development of calcium salts in the 1980s that pioneered the frontier for what is today a variety of successful bypass fat supplements. Now, the beginning idea for calcium salts was born in very basic laboratory studies done at the Ohio State University, and that was followed up by cooperative agreements with Church & Dwight Incorporated of Princeton, New Jersey, for its commercial development and marketing. So we have two individuals with us today to describe the history of calcium salts from those initial lab studies through its commercial development. We're fortunate to have Dr. Don Palmquist, Professor Emeritus from the Ohio State University, who pioneered the beginning idea of calcium salts and managed those initial lab studies, as well as Dr. Ken Cummings, who is retired from Church & Dwight, who partnered with Dr. Palmquist to develop scaled-up production and commercialization of a final product. So thank you both for being here today. And before we get into today's topic, I'd like to start with just have the viewers know a little bit about your background, and maybe Don will start with you.
Okay.
And I think you're a West Coast person. Yes.
Yes, I was born in the Willamette Valley of Western Oregon, in the town of Silverton, near the capital, Salem. We lived on a small farm. My father's parents were immigrants from Scandinavia. We always had a few cows, but never any really commercial activity there. I went to high school in Silverton and took a lot of OAG, and then went on to Oregon State University, where I majored in dairy production. I was the oldest of the children in the family. There were 6 of us, and quite strung out over 25 years. But all the boys, the 4 boys, all ended up in some aspect of agriculture, but not in production.
So it was the farm in Oregon that supported the family?
That, and my dad worked in sawmills.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When I was in college, I had a professor that was pretty wise in my looking back at it all, who convinced me to go to grad school, although I didn't know what grad school was. And went to the University of California at Davis, and I got my education there, grad education in animal nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
From there, spent 2 years on a postdoc at the University of Illinois, working on the metabolites that are used to synthesize milk fatty acids.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1967, I joined the faculty at the Ohio State University in Worcester at the Ag Experiment Station.
Okay, very good. And Ken, West Coast for Don. Was it East Coast for Ken?
No, I was very much in the Midwest. I was born in Arkansas.
Oh, okay.
In a little town that was the whittling capital of the world. To tell you a little bit about the industry there, it was White Oak whiskey barrels, I think, was about the major industry. My father and mother moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma area, and we lived there for a brief period of time, and then on down to Fort Worth, Texas. My dad was involved in the aircraft industry at that point in time, and this was during the war years, World War II years, and shortly after. We moved back to the Tulsa area in 1951 and bought a little 80-acre farm, and I became, at 12 years of age, sort of the resident farmer. My dad bought a tractor, and we had a few beef cows and so forth, and down the road was a dairy farm, and it seemed like that whenever I was willing to give them some labor, they were willing to take it. So I milked few cows into my high school years, and I'd have to say that the most influential person in my life at that point in time was my VOAG teacher. And he convinced me and several of the other boys in the class to go to college, and Oklahoma State University was about 85 miles away, and so I did my undergraduate degree there, milking cows all through college, and actually majored in ag education, thinking I was going to be a VOAG teacher. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was fomenting at that point in time, and so I joined the local National Guard and spent some time in the National Guard and Army Reserves, and then came back at the end of my BS degree out of the Army looking for a job, and worked for a year in agricultural sales with Morton Salt Company, which was just beginning an agricultural division. And by chance I met an individual on an airplane who happened to be the assistant department head of animal science at Purdue University, and he asked me, had I ever thought about going to graduate school? And like Don, you know, I barely knew what graduate school was all about at the time, but I said, you know, it sounds interesting to me. And so he sent me an application, and I'd just gotten married, and my wife had actually spent a couple of years at Oklahoma State and had quit school at the time we got married, and had a job there in Tulsa. And so she was excited about being able to go back to school, and so we went to Indiana, and I ended up getting a master's and PhD in dairy nutrition under Dr. Carl Knoller.
Okay.
And from there I went to Mississippi State as a faculty member for about 8 years, and then to Colorado State in a similar kind of position. And then at the end of that 3 or 4 years period of time, I was offered the opportunity to come to the East Coast and work for Church and Dwight in developing the use of sodium bicarbonate for animals.
Yeah.
And that was in 1979, and that began my 27-year career with Church and Dwight, which then got me into a lot of other activities, and that's when I first met Don.
Okay, very good. Well, before we get into the calcium salt story, Don, just a little bit about the fat feeding picture prior to that time, because I know you traveled worldwide, and you had your finger in the pulse of what most people were doing when it comes to fat feeding, not only in the United States but elsewhere. And fat feeding was to dairy cattle, was that a regular thing at that time? Was it accepted? What was the general mood about using fat supplements for dairy cattle prior to calcium salts?
Well, interestingly, I've looked at the National Research Council recommendations for feeding dairy cattle, and there's no reference at all to using fat in dairy rations until about 1989. But going back in the literature, L.A. Maynard at Cornell had shown in the 1930s that if the cow was fed a very low-fat diet, that milk production was lower. When I started my investigations in the importance of fat in the ration, I became aware that in Denmark it was common to feed supplemental fats. And when I pursued that further, it was because in Denmark a very high proportion of the feed was fodder beets, barley straw, and feeds of that nature that had almost no fat at all in them. And they were able to show clearly under those feeding conditions that it was necessary to supplement fat. But it was not common in the United States.
What kind of fat sources were they using?
Well,
at that time?
there was tallow. There was also becoming, in the 60s, a product called animal vegetable fat, or even yellow grease, and or hydrolyzed vegetable fatty acids. These became available in increased amounts because the soap industry was changing from traditional soap to detergents. And this released a lot of fat stock they were using for soap making to be used for other purposes. And so the National Renders Association organized a subsidiary, the Fats and Proteins Research Foundation, to investigate the use of some of these fats for animal feed. And primarily that was focused on the poultry industry. But those products were available. The Fats and Proteins Research Foundation was interested in finding ways to use their fats in on-farm feeding. They needed what they called dry fats. Ordinary fat had to be heated to be used, and that was inconvenient on farms.
And we were also well aware by this time that we had to limit the amount of fat that we're feeding.
Yes, research had been shown since really the late 1950s that any supplemental fatty acids in any amount in rumen fermentation systems would alter the rumen fermentation, and when fed to dairy cows would actually cause milk fat depression.
Yeah, as well as maybe some other production problems as well. Yeah. So the idea of calcium salts came to you when? When did this idea first emerge?
Well, that idea itself came to me in 1979, but to give a little history to why it came to me. At Illinois, I had worked with small molecule metabolism and actually quantified their contribution to milk fat synthesis. And milk fat depression was a big issue at that time because farmers were feeding a lot of corn to get enough energy into the cows. And when I finished my work at Illinois, I went to Ohio and was interested. The question at that time was, there obviously about half of the milk fat is coming from the long chain fatty acids. But there was debate about whether adipose tissue was important for that contribution, or how important was fat from the diet. So we used radiotracer studies to quantify some of that, and came up with estimates that about 90% of the long chain fatty acids in milk fat come directly from the diet. And so we had done digestion trials and so forth, trying to understand how much fat we could put in the diet. And in one study with Jersey cows, they went down during the digestion trial with mid-lactation milk fever. And I had to add calcium to the diet, even though it was not experimentally proper. We had to do that to save the cows. When we analyzed the data from that study, there was a bit of serendipity here, that very clearly adding calcium to the diets improved the utilization of not only of the fat, but the whole ration. So I was able to get funding from the Fats and Proteins Research Foundation for a postdoc. And I was very fortunate to hire a young postdoc from Cornell by the name of Tom Jenkins. And I challenged you to try to develop understanding of the interaction between calcium, fatty acids, and fiber digestion. And you did a lot of work in vitro, made a lot of progress, but we could never, even with addition of calcium, totally overcome this inhibition of fiber digestion by adding calcium. Well, about that time I was going on my first trip to Europe, and among other places I stopped at the Rowett Research Institute in Scotland and talked to a very fine lipid chemist by the name of Ken Loff, who had described very well intestinal digestion of fats in dairy cows. And talking to him, I said, while I'm traveling on this trip, I've been puzzling over how to overcome this problem with fatty acids in the ration, and I said, maybe we need to actually feed calcium salts of fats. And he said, it won't work. We've already tried it. The fatty acids are biohydrogenated. Well, I came back and suggested to you that maybe we should try the calcium salts in the fermentation systems in vitro. And you found the secret. You didn't measure biohydrogenation of the fatty acids. You measured fiber digestion. Mm-hmm. And very clearly, the calcium salts overcame the inhibition of fiber digestion by the fatty acids. Mm-hmm. So that was late 79, early 1980. Mm-hmm. We published a couple of abstracts and hadn't published more than that before the industry became aware of what we were doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll always be proud to have been a part of those early initial studies where this was getting laid out, but even hearing you describe it today gives me a bigger overview picture of how all the parts of it was working. So we were able to make some calcium salts of our own. Initially, grams of it.
Yes.
Yeah. So very small bench laboratory studies. And then at some point, you decided that this needed to be fed to an animal. Well,
you had gone to the literature and found a very straightforward way to make calcium salts in the laboratory, but it wasn't particularly well suited to making large amounts. After we did the in vitro studies and showed the dramatic effect on fiber digestion, it was a eureka moment. We continued to do some work on that fiber digestion, but the next question what we had to show was, are these calcium salts utilized by the animal? So we had to feed some. And you were instrumental in finding these two steers that we put both rumen and intestinal cannulas in, Mel and Gus, I think you called them.
We did. Yeah.
And worked out some quite sophisticated techniques for labeling the fiber in the feed, and fed these to the steers. And you showed that indeed the digestibility of the calcium salts was acceptable.
Yeah.
Then we wanted to do dairy trials, and so we went to the feed mill on a hot summer day, and we had 100-pound old alkali drums, a little bigger than a big wastebasket. Then we'd put 10 pounds of fatty acids in the can and heat that up on hot plates, which immediately shut off all the breakers in the building because it was a hot day. But when this was hot, we added calcium chloride solution, which immediately precipitated the calcium salts. And we had a solution then of about 10 or 12 pounds of calcium salts and a lot of water. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it was an undergraduate, helping us, so we were trying to get the water out of this mess. And he brought the janitor's mop bucket in. And we found that that was a rather effective way to get the water out of the calcium salts.
Squeezing it through cheesecloth.
Squeezing through cheesecloth.
Yeah.
But then we still had to lay it out on the floor and let it dry a few days. And then because it was rather chunky, we had to run it through a hammer mill, and we ended up with a powder.
Yeah.
In this description, I think you can see why we never did publish a lot of actually feeding or lactation studies with the calcium supplement.
Yeah, because it took a lot of work and a lot of labor to come up with enough to do those small number cow studies. Yeah. So the idea was born. The initial lab studies showed its effectiveness. We've found a way to synthesize enough of it to feed the cows, and then at some point came the idea that this might have implications on a bigger commercial scale. Can you recall the roots of that thinking when the idea of patenting this first came about?
Well, because we had so much time spent in just making this material, I'd been in contact with a Mallinckrodt company, chemical company, that made a calcium stearate for the plastics industry. And several meetings with their representative asking if they could make a calcium salt of tallow fatty acids for our work. And after the second or third meeting, he said, nobody will touch this, will work on it at all without patent protection. So we immediately, with the university, wrote up a patent application, and that was accomplished in June of 1981. In October of 1981, I had a phone call from England, the Volac company in Royston near Cambridge, England. And they had been searching for a way to use fats in dairy feeding. And I had 2 meetings with them in October of that year. And I don't recall if you were involved in the meetings at this time, but they pushed me pretty hard on whether this could be commercially successful. And I said, based on the research, it should work. Mm-hmm. So they immediately set forth to work from their standpoint.
The patent eventually was filed by Ohio State University.
Yes,
Yeah.
We had a lot of pushback from the patent office and had to do several more studies, some of which you were involved in, where we looked at the rate of calcium soap formation in the rumen of the cow, yeah. Mm-hmm. and so forth. And with those data, finally in 1987, the patent was approved.
Yeah, yeah. Now, somewhere along the way there began to be some interchange between you and Church and Dwight about the commercialization of it. I suppose did that happen after the patent was received?
No, it was before.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe about 1984 we might have had our first contact.
Yeah.
Or late 83 or 84.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Ken was your contact person?
No, not at that time.
Okay.
It was Judy Downer.
Okay.
And Dave Rock.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In those initial discussions.
Okay. And Ken, I want to bring in Church and Dwight's side of things a little bit right now. Up to this point in time, Church and Dwight wasn't known as of having any fat products commercially available, but there must have been some interest in looking into fats and securing some sort of fat products to the company up about this time that was going on. Is that right?
That's exactly right. We've been very successful over a period of years with the implementation of sodium bicarbonate as an amendment for dairy cattle and other species of animals also, and certainly to be a significant player in the animal nutrition business, you couldn't be a one-trick pony and just have sodium bicarbonate. So we started having some what we call think tank sessions and talking about what other products could we develop for specifically dairy cattle, because that's where it appeared that our market was headed. And we had Dr. Bill Chalupa was involved in a lot of those discussions, and he was at the University of Pennsylvania, and so we started looking at other things, and I'd had a little bit of experience in terms of feeding products that were high in fat when I was on the faculty at Mississippi State. But in terms of these brainstorming sessions and so forth, and identifying a source of a bypass fat, and we knew enough about fats at that point in time to know that you couldn't just feed straight fatty materials to a dairy cow in very high percentage of the total ration. So I had already been over to Europe and had talked to British Petroleum, and they had a product called BP Fat Prills, which was a prilled fat product. And we actually brought a container of that over, and Dr. Chalupa fed some of that down at the University of Pennsylvania, and we were not really pleased with the outcome of those studies and so forth, and so we were continuing to look for a source of rumen bypass fat, as we called it. Mm-hmm. And we recognized that Dr. Palmquist had done some work out at Ohio State, and we talked with him and Dr. Judy Downer on behalf of Church and Dwight, and Dr. David Rock went out and talked with Don and got information about this company over in the UK, which was named Volac, mm-hmm. and that they were beginning to attempt to make products and to commercialize a calcium soap product in Europe. And so we contacted them in 1984 and worked out an agreement for us to be a licensee of Volac in 1985, and started commercialization or building a plant to commercialize the technology that they had here in the United States. And in mid-1986, we brought over enough commercial product to do a test market in the U.S., and not having our plant completed in Old Fort, Ohio, by the way. And I believe it was in 1987, June of 1987, the plant was completed, and the first product was produced here on U.S. soil, a commercialized calcium soap product for dairy cattle. It was called Megalac, okay, which was the same name that Volac had used over in the UK. And certainly during that process, we were sponsoring some additional research with Dr. Palmquist and some other people around the country to get enough data to support the claims that we were going to make. And certainly, without a doubt, FDA was interested in what we were doing, and we had to do a lot of work to prove that that the product was a feed product and not a drug. Yeah. And so that was the very beginning of the commercialization process on behalf of Church and Dwight.
Yeah. Now, during this whole time, like you said, there were a number of universities that were getting into the. This was drawing a lot of attention, and a lot of universities were trying to get their hands on calcium salts to do dairy cattle studies with it.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think a lot of those came before the plant in Old Fort was up and running.
It did, and Volac certainly was sponsoring some trials in Europe also. Mm-hmm. And because we were a licensee of Volac, we certainly were cooperating with them and were privy to all of the research that was being generated on behalf of Volac in Europe. And yes, there were a number of studies that were generated during that period of time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You know, these things don't happen because of the efforts of one person. And although I've got the two key people right here, there's still lots of people that had to operate in the background. Don, who was some of the key people that you had working with you over the years on this, in terms of graduate students, technicians?
Well, probably in order of contributions, the first name would be Tom Jenkins.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah.
A young lady in my lab who was my lab manager and technician really turned out to be a fantastic person in terms of both teaching and supervising the students that came in my lab. Her name was Donna Kinsey at that time, now Donna Wyatt, and a lot is owed to her for keeping the lab going.
Yeah.
The first graduate students we had working, there was Ann Maxilak, who had looked at the effect of individual unsaturated fatty acids on the growth of specific pure cultures of rumen bacteria. And that's quite a widely quoted paper. And that was published about 1982, in 81 or 82. Judd Heinrichs, who's a long time at Penn State, did some of the first feeding trials on farms with different forms of fat. I don't think he used any calcium soaps because we hadn't got that far yet. Mm-hmm. And then 2 PhD students did a lot of work on digestibility and rumen metabolism. And one of those fellows from Nigeria was Oji Hajaruka, who did not continue in academia. The other was Zhigua Wu from China, and he did some excellent studies showing the utilization of fatty acids in the intestine and so forth. Those were the primary ones. Later, my last graduate student, Barry Choi from Korea, one of the things that we had noted over the years was when cows were fed any type of fat, but particularly the calcium soaps, that feed intake was a bit lower. As the cow feeder used to say, in a pen of 20 cows, he fed 1 cow less if the calcium soap was in the mix. So Barry focused on regulation of feed intake and the effect of fats on that. And he made some very good contributions there in conjunction with Mike Allen at Michigan State University, who has continued to work in the area of regulation of feed intake.
Yeah, for sure. There's been a long list of contributors in the whole project. On the Church and Dwight side, you've already mentioned some of the early names that were there when you first got in.
Sure, let me mention a couple more. Certainly from the VOLAC organization, and I think, Don, you may have already mentioned the involvement of Dr. Trevor Tompkins and Philip Paxman from VOLAC in the very early days. And the man who started VOLAC started as a milk replacer company way back early, and his name was Dick Laws, and he was a very amazing little guy. And he was not afraid as a private company to invest in things, and I think that's the reason that he ever got involved in the development of calcium soaps for dairy cattle. But certainly other people that were involved from a Church and Dwight standpoint over the years, Doug Merrill, who's the director of marketing at Church and Dwight, was very much an enthusiast for this product, and without a real good relationship between marketing and technical activities at Church and Dwight, we would have never developed the product, because it takes a lot of people within a company to get a product to that point. And certainly from the standpoint of people that were involved in additional research, I mentioned Dr. Chalupa, but there were a number of universities, probably as many as 20 or so universities in this country actually did research on Megalac as the commercial product was known at that point in time. Not only in dairy cattle, but it was fed to almost every species of animals. Certainly in monogastrics, it was not a success for a lot of reasons and wasn't necessary. But certainly from beef cattle standpoint and the other things that have evolved from that technology, and here we are talking about almost 30 years of existence, and the product, calcium soaps today are probably sold in most of the countries of the world where dairy cattle are in existence. And my estimate is probably at least 500,000 tons a year of that product is sold, not just Megalac but other calcium soaps. Certainly where you have success, you have imitators, and that certainly happened. And although there are a lot of patents and so forth involved here, it certainly didn't keep other people from commercializing other types of products.
Yeah, well, very good. Well, thank you both very much for your time and for sharing the story with us from the beginning through where we are today. It's certainly a great success story, as you indicated. It's still very strong, opened the door for many other products to enter in the market, and been a big contributor to dairy cow performance in the industry. So thank you again very much.
Well, it certainly was an exciting part of our lives, wasn't it, Don?
It's a pleasure to share that with you.
Thank you very much.